Tito asked me to do this, gosh, I don't know, a year ago or so, and then as the date got closer, he gave me instructions on what he wanted me to talk about. And I thought, oh yeah, what are the chances that I'm going to have something that's relevant and relates to what he actually wanted? And he said, well, we're interested in human capital and intergenerational aspects of human capital and transfers from one group to another. And I said, well, I have a paper that's kind of related to this, and I gave it. And then the more I started thinking about it, I realized that it's not just related, it's about as perfectly suited to the question that he was asking as anything I've ever written for sure, and certainly anything I've ever thought about. So just pure coincidence, but the story that I'm going to tell you today is really about how human capital passes through a society, and that's the more general question. What happens when we see human capital? What does that do in terms of affecting productivity? And the actual application that I'm going to talk about is entrepreneurship. But entrepreneurship is really a special case of the more general problem that I think Tito was thinking about, which is, what happens as a society changes its structure? How does that affect the transmission of human capital from one generation to the next generation? All right. So we're a university here. We always think about teachers and students, and of course you might think about a situation where you could have too many students and not enough teachers, or you could have the reverse. You could have too many teachers and not enough students. You've got all these teachers hanging around and no one to learn. So the question is, how do we think about that? And I'm going to try to convince you that that's an important problem. Now, let me tell you a story to motivate this. The idea behind this paper, I must say, is not really mine. It comes from one of my students, the first author on this. And James is a guy who wrote his PhD under me at Stanford University. But James is a very interesting guy. He's a very unusual guy. And the reason he's unusual is that, first of all, he's old for a PhD student. He was about 35, I think, when he came to Stanford to do his PhD. In fact, I was in the White House at the time. I was still in the government, and I didn't know anything about the guy. I get back, and here's this guy, James, taking my class. I say, hey, this is a pretty smart guy, so we start working together. Then, about halfway through his dissertation, I find out that he is the founder of a company called C-Trip. Now, C-Trip, for most of you won't know C-Trip, but C-Trip is the largest travel agency in China. And when he founded it, it was the largest internet company in China, okay? So this guy is a pretty big deal. Everybody knows his name in China. They don't know him as James. He has another Chinese name. But everybody knows who he is. And whenever I say, my student James Leong, everybody says, oh yeah, this guy's super famous because he was a real pioneer. Now, James's life story is actually the motivation for this paper. And so let me tell you a little bit about James. So James is he's a brilliant guy, a very smart guy, very creative guy. He went to Fudan University in China at 14. And Fudan University is that's like in the United States, it would be like going to MIT at 14. It's like the highest place for technical prominence in all of China. And then after he got his degree there, he came to the United States, actually went to Georgia Tech, did more computer science, and finished when he was about 20 years old. And then went to work for a company called Oracle, which is a very big company now, but at the time was already an established company, but was kind of a middle-sized company. And what happened to James was something that was common in Silicon Valley. That is, young people going to companies that are startups or kind of middle-sized companies and ending up in a very short period of time at the top of the firm's hierarchy. So James became, by the time he was 28 years old, he was the head of all consulting for Oracle. So he was a senior vice president and head of all consulting for Oracle at 28, all right? Now, of course, we know many 28-year-olds, Zuckerberg, and, there are many famous entrepreneurs who have done this. But the point is that because James was at a very high-level position in Oracle, he was given responsibilities that he would not have had he been in another environment. So for example, had he been in Italy, chances are at 28 years old, you're not going to be the senior vice president of a large company. It probably takes you to get to, be 50 or so years old because, as we know, Italy is an aging society. You got a lot of old guys like me at the top of the hierarchy who are blocking all the slots for the young guys like you. And that's essentially the structure that James didn't have to deal with because he was in a society, namely Silicon Valley, where everybody was young. If you weren't young, you didn't know the technology. You simply weren't able to do what was necessary. So, the story that we're going to tell that relates to Tito's original question is that the transmission of skills to the young generation, the passing of human capital to younger people within the workforce depends on the age structure of the firm specifically, but of the society in general. And what we will show you is that this force is so powerful that it is by far the most important explanatory variable in determining business formation across countries. And we, as I say, we kind of lucked out on this. When I show you the data, I think I'll be able to convince you that this is true, but it was sort of something that was just discovered really almost by accident as a result of kind of thinking about James's career and others who were in this position. So the argument is going to be the following. That when you think about starting a business, and as I say, starting a business is only one example of this because even being productive in someone else's business that is started depends on the skills that you have. So it's going to be the same kind of idea, but I want you to think about it in the context of business formation because business formation is certainly one of, if not the most important engine of economic growth. And so when you think about starting a business, what you want to think about is that there are basically two ingredients. I think maybe this one. I'll just use this. That's okay. It doesn't. This is okay. Don't worry. Two basic ingredients, and the two are that in order to start a business, in order to do something like that or make a business grow, you have to have creativity, a good idea, and energy. And that tends to be something in which young people have a comparative advantage. They're the ones who have lots of new ideas and lots of energy. But you also have to know something. You also have to have some skill. And 20-year-olds may be highly energetic and highly creative, but they don't have skills. It takes a while to acquire those skills. And it's going to be the combination of those two factors that creates the environment necessary to start a business. And so what we're going to do in this presentation is I'm going to argue that those two factors in combination with one another have very strong implications for how a society will actually grow and form businesses. And that's the basic idea. So the example that I'll give you, and I since I'm in Italy, I can substitute Italy or Japan. We were actually thinking of this in the context of Japan. So the motivation for this was actually an empirical motivation. We looked at Japan and we said, Japan was such a dynamic country in the 80s. You guys, most of you are too young, although I see a few with gray hair in here and even a couple of guys with no hair like me, sir. But most of you don't remember, but in the 80s, everybody was worried about Japan. Japan was going to take over the world because Japan was forming all the new businesses. They had very high growth rates. The best quality products were coming out of Japan. And then something happened. And then the 90s came along and Japan started to slow. And in the 2000s, of course, Japan has continued to have very slow growth rates. And most people attributed that to the financial crisis that hit Japan in the early 90s, and that I'm sure was partly to blame. But Korea had a financial crisis in the early 90s, and Korea's growing like crazy and was able to overcome that. Thailand, plenty of countries in Asia had these financial crises and didn't have the same continuing problems that Japan had. So what happened to Japan? What's the most important factor in Japan? Well, there's only one country that leads Italy in the world, I think, in terms of aging, at least among the developing countries, and that is Japan. So Italy's a very rapidly aging country, but Japan is worse. And so what happened was you got a society that was young and dynamic in the 80s that aged and became old and stodgy in the 90s and 2000s. And what we will show you is that that is what we think is the major factor in accounting for this slowdown, not only in Japan, but also across the world. So I was talking to Francesco Giavazzi earlier today, and he was talking about that in the context of the political economy in Italy, and was telling me a little bit about it. And then now he said that, of course, you have a young prime minister, a 39-year-old prime minister. So perhaps you'll move back somewhat in the other direction. But we'll see. So anyway, but think of that as your main motivation. All right. So the model that I'm going to put up, and I'm just this is an evening lecture. You're all tired. You've had a long day, so I won't give you lots and lots of technical stuff. But I'm going to show you 2 pages of a little bit of technical stuff. But basically, you can get the whole. You already know the story. I already told you. But let me sort of translate it into a little bit more technical terms. So the main implications and findings, as well as implications, is that older countries have lower average entrepreneurship rates. So if you look, for example, across the world, the youngest country in the world in our data happens to be Uganda in Africa. It's the youngest country in the world. And Uganda has a 16% rate of entrepreneurship. So 16% of the people have formed a business within the last 42 months. If you look at old countries like Germany, Italy, Japan, business formation is much, much lower there. So that's going to be the first implication, and again, it comes out of the story that I told you. But what's more important, and this is really the key finding that relates back to what Tito asked me to do initially, is that old countries do not have low rates of entrepreneurship because they're full of old people who are lazy and out of ideas. The reason that old countries have low entrepreneurship rates is that they don't pass the skills to the young. And the easiest way to see that is that at any given age level, it's going to be true that younger countries have higher rates of entrepreneurship than older countries. So, for example, I mentioned Korea and Japan earlier. Think about Korea and Japan. Korea is a relatively young country. Japan's a relatively old, very old country, okay? If you look at 30-year-olds in Korea and you compare them to 30-year-olds in Japan, they're still 30-year-olds, but what you'll find is the 30-year-olds in Korea are more entrepreneurial than the 30-year-olds in Japan. The 50-year-olds in Korea are more entrepreneurial than the 50-year-olds in Japan. So it's the within age group difference across countries that really makes this story go and lets me feel like I'm actually answering the question that you posed to me initially. And as an empirical matter, that is by far the most important effect. It's not the fact that old people are less creative than the young people. It's the fact that the cross-country variation which affects entrepreneurship rates within any given age group, that effect is so strong that it totally dictates what the entrepreneurship rate is going to be for a country. Dominates everything else. And again, I'm making big, grandiose statements, but I'll try to convince you that it's actually true when I show you some numbers. Okay? Now, third point. The relationship of entrepreneurship to age is inverted U-shape. And that comes from the story I told you earlier. It takes 2 forces to become an entrepreneur. You have to be young and have energy, but you also have to know something, okay? and it takes some time to acquire the skills necessary to know something. So initially, if it were just the case that the first factor, creativity and energy, was important, what we would see is a monotonically declining rate of entrepreneurship with age. The young guys would have the highest rate, the old guys would have the lowest rate. But that's not what we see. In fact, what we see is an inverted U, and that's because there are two factors. Creativity is fine, but at first you have to acquire the skills. Once you've acquired the skills, then the aging, slowing creativity effect comes into play. And I'll show you that is true empirically. And then fourth, if we look across countries and we say which age group is going to be most affected by changes in the age structure of a country, it's the middle-aged guys. And there's a reason for that, which comes technically out of the theory, but the basic idea is that the bulk of entrepreneurship happens among 30-year-olds. That's where it happens, 30 to 40. And the group that is most severely affected by the kind of mechanism that I'm talking about, namely this transmission of human capital from the old to the young, is exactly that group. And so they get killed when a country ages, and I'll show you that. All right, so before I show you any theory or any numbers, I'm going to summarize all the results with this one picture. And this one picture basically proves, in some sense, everything that I was saying was true on the previous slide. So all this does is it graphs the entrepreneurship rate, the rate of business formation, and I should define that, but let me put that aside for a moment, assume I got that right, okay? So it's the rate of entrepreneurship at any given age level, and it does it for three groups of countries. So we're going to have, in these data, we have 82 countries. We divided them up into three groups: young countries, middle countries, and old countries. And the young countries are the ones characterized by that dotted line at the very top of the graph. And what you see is that that young country line is everywhere above the middle country line, which is everywhere above the old country line. And so what that tells you is that within any age group, within any given age group, the entrepreneurship rate in young countries is higher than the entrepreneurship rate in middle countries, which is higher than the entrepreneurship rate in old countries. So that was the first point that I made, and that's going to be true, okay? Second point. I told you it was an inverted U shape. Well, kind of looks that way, right? Particularly the young one is the most inverted U, but you see that inverted U, the young guys have low rates of entrepreneurship rate, the 30-year-olds have the highest, and then by the time you're getting to be my age, you're out of gas. Have nothing left in your brain to invent. Okay, so that fits the prediction. And then the third point, which was a little bit more subtle, is that the inverted U is most pronounced in the young countries. So remember I said which group gets killed when you go from a young country to an old country, and I said it's the middle-aged guys. And the way to see that is that if you look at this peak and you say, what's the difference between this and this? That's a really big distance. But the difference between this point and this point, or even this point and this point, is much smaller. So the group that experiences the largest change in entrepreneurship rates when we go from young countries to old countries is the middle-aged group, and that's what I said earlier, okay? And that comes out of a demographic theory. All right, so I'm going to take, let's see, you're my timekeeper, about another 20 minutes, okay? Something like that? 20, 25 minutes? All right, because I need to leave some time for Pietro before I put everybody to sleep. Okay, all right, so I'm going to show you the model very briefly, but to show that I still have some technical skills left in my brain. I want to show you that I can actually do algebra. But there's a reason for putting up the model, because I think it exemplifies what you can get out of a very simple structure, and lots of theoretical predictions that are actually borne out by the data, which to my mind is still the best way to do applied research. So let me try to convince you that's true. So there's a demographic model and there's an economic model, and each one just takes one page. So here's the demographic structure. So what I want you to think about is the proportion of people who are in any given age cohort A is given by this formula. And what's this formula? What's the R? The R is what I'm going to call the shrinkage parameter. It's the rate at which a country's population is shrinking. So if R is high, it's shrinking very rapidly. That means it's an old country, like Italy. If R is negative, that means it has a negative shrinkage rate, or it has a growth rate, and that's a country like Uganda. So if you look at these numbers, what we're thinking of is this is a one-parameter description of the entire world. Okay? And what I'm going to claim, since I've been making all these statements about how wonderful this thing is, let me make one more. All right? So what I'm going to claim is that this model, this simple demographic model, explains the demographic structure of the entire world perfectly. Perfectly. Okay? And again, I'll show, that's an empirical statement, but I'll show that to you. Okay? So this one parameter model basically does the job. So
what do you mean by demographic?
The whole, so if I look at within any given country, and I want to know the age distribution of the country, so I just say how many people at any given age, this model gives me a prediction for how many people at any given age in any given country, and that's going to be true for every age group, for every country in the entire world. Right, that's exactly right. So, but it's a summary statistic. So, it's when you say it's a sufficient statistic. I can't infer mortality or birth rates from this, because you're giving me too many. You're giving me too many variables to do it. But as sort of the equilibrium is determined by this. Now, I want to say something. Again, this is an aside, but I want to say an aside. So my dear friend and mentor, who passed away about a year ago, Gary Becker, when I first showed him this, he always used to tease me, and he would always say things like, you didn't read that? You've never heard of that? And of course it was some obscure thing, that was back like 100 years ago, and I'd say, no, I never read it, and then I'd feel bad. Well, it turns out this one, so when I showed him this, he said, well, don't you know Latka's work? I said, no, I never. Well, Latka is a demographer, a very famous demographer, one of the pioneering mathematical demographers from the early 20th century. Wrote a volume on formal demography, and he derived exactly what you're talking about, where these equilibrium relationships of demography, looking at birth rates, death rates, and then looking at the population. And this is, in some sense, a simple summary of the equilibrium that he wrote down 100 years ago. So, it's not that novel. I mean, we came upon it by accident, basically, but it's well established in the literature. This is not our creation. What's important for us is that this simple structure is the basis for all our theoretical predictions, and so it's necessary that it fit the world well in order for our theoretical predictions to be accurate. Okay. All right, good. So, there are some properties of this structure, and the two that are most important is, first of all, when a country ages, that is, when R is high, the country is shrinking, then the proportion of people younger, I'm actually doing lemma 2 first, the proportion of people younger than you tends to fall. So you want to be, if you're a young person, actually if you're at any age, you want to be in a country that is growing rapidly, because then you're going to have a larger share of the population younger than you. So in a country like Uganda, if you're a 20-year-old, 80% of the population is already younger than you, because everybody's just been born in the last 20 years. Whereas if you're in Italy and you're a 20-year-old, 80% of the population is older than you. And so what you want is a low, actually a negative R, in order to have a lot of people younger than you. And then the second one, and this is where this middle of the U thing comes from, is that when a country ages, so not age specific, but when a country ages, when R goes up, the group that is affected the most, the share that is affected the most, is that group in the middle range. So 35-year-olds are the ones whose share is affected the most by aging. That's again that's just mechanical. It just comes out of the functional form that we assumed, and that's what gives us this result about the U falling. But that's why this particular structure is useful and important. All right. To us. So here's a picture of countries with different R's. So here's Uganda. Uganda has lots and lots of young people and very, very few old people. So I'm arranging people, ages are now normalized between 0 and 1. So 1 is the oldest age. That's 60. Actually, we're only looking at the working age population. So these are 64-year-olds and these are 20-year-olds. And this is Uganda. And this one is Japan. Okay, so Japan has more old people than young people. And that is simply a picture of what we get from that formula, that demographic formula that I showed you earlier. That's all it is. Okay? All right, now let me do the economic model, and then I'm going to turn to the results. So the economic model is very simple. It basically says you become an entrepreneur when the value of being an entrepreneur exceeds the value that you can earn from working on a job, wage and salary job, say for Fiat or something, okay? And so what does that depend on? Well, that value, V, depends on three things. Depends on your human capital, the skills that you have. Better the skills, the more likely you're to come up with a good idea. It depends on your creativity, Q. And it depends on that little C thing, which is a random variable reflecting luck. So the same person, some mornings you get up, you're taking a shower, you have a good idea. Some mornings you get up, you're having a stupid idea. That's C, okay? And so you have to hope for a good shower. That's basically what we're looking at there. And so what this says is that you'll start the business when V is greater than 1. And if you just work through it, you come up with a formula that says that the proportion of entrepreneurs in any given society will be, at any given age A, will be a function of R, such that the following propositions hold. And so let me work you through those propositions very quickly. They're basically what I told you earlier. So the first proposition is that at any given entrepreneurship at any given age A is decreasing in R. 30-year-olds in Japan are less likely to be entrepreneurs than 30-year-olds in Korea. That's proposition 1. Corollary 1 is simply another way to state that. For any given age group A, 30-year-olds in Japan versus 30-year-olds in Korea, if I look at the share of the population that's younger than them, that's what SA is, the share that's younger than they are. The larger the share that's younger than they are, the higher the rate of entrepreneurship. So Korea, if you're 30 years old, you have a lot of people younger than you. If you're in Japan, you're 30-year-olds, you don't have many people younger than you. That's bad for entrepreneurship. So that's just a restatement of the same point. It's also true that holding share constant, holding the demographic structure constant, old people are less entrepreneurial than young people. That's the creativity effect. That's the energy and creativity effect. So the idea there is simply that the older you are, you run out of gas, and that's a corollary to this that comes right out of this model and out of this structure. Proposition 2 is that if I look across countries, I look at Uganda and I compare it to Japan, and I want to explain why the average entrepreneurship rate throughout the whole country is lower in Japan than in Uganda. That's because R in Uganda is lower than R in Japan. Now, it turns out that sounds trivial. It's not quite as trivial as it sounds. Actually, that was one of the hardest proofs in the paper. And the reason is, just as a technical aside for those of you who get excited about this stuff, the reason is that when you age the population, you have two things going on. You have the entrepreneurship rate within any age group falling, but you also change the proportion of people at each age. And so you have a composition effect that you have to take into account at the same time as you're taking into account the age effect. And the combination of those two makes it a little less obvious than it seems. Okay, but that's the result. The others, we've pretty much been through, so I'm going to just jump ahead and turn to the data. So let me tell you about the data, because we're going to run out of time otherwise. So let me tell you about the data. The data come from a survey that was done in England, in the UK. There's a group in England that did this thing called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Survey. And it's the first survey of its kind. It started in 2000. And what they did was they went around the world and they sampled about 1 million people total. And asked them whether they had started businesses and some other questions that were relevant. Of course, they tried to make it comparable. That's the thing that makes it nice, is they're trying to be able to compare things in the United States and Uganda. Now, you know, you're not going to be able to do that because, again, what we mean by a business may be different in the U.S. versus something in, you know, Benin or someone with, you know, some other place like that, or even Korea. But to the extent possible, that's what they tried to do. And the definition that we use, for the most part in this paper, we actually explore four other definitions, but the definition of entrepreneurship that we use is that you are a person who manages and owns a business that is up to 42 months old, because I want to know the age at which you started this business. That's key for this thing. And you pay wages. So this is not someone who's just self-employed. If you're a self-employed cleaning person, for example, you would not be considered an entrepreneur. If you were a self-employed cleaning person who had 10 other cleaning persons working for you, you would be considered an entrepreneur by this definition. Okay? So that's how it's defined. That's basically what we have in the data. In addition to that, we used population. We had to have the demographics of the world. So the United States Census Bureau actually has the demographics of the world. They do population counts for 200 countries, and those are the ones that we used in these data. We also, as I will show you, we also wanted some controls. So we put in GDP per capita, tertiary education, startup costs, and property rights indexes, which people usually think of as being important in determining entrepreneurship rates. Okay? So we'll see how they play out. So this is the table of summary statistics. The only one that I want you to look at is this one. This is just the average rate of entrepreneurship in the whole sample. It's 6%. So 6% of the entire sample of about over 1 million people have started businesses in the last 42 months. It's actually pretty high. Okay, now again, most of these businesses are small. Starting a restaurant on the corner would be considered entrepreneurship here, so bear that in mind. All right, now I told you at the beginning, and you guys were, I could tell, a little bit skeptical, that this model, my empirical model, fits the world, demographic model fits the world perfectly, and here's what I mean. So what we do is we fit an R for each country. How do we do that? Well, we have 45 age groups in each country. So use that equation that I showed you up there, this little guy. Estimate that non-linearly and estimate your R for any given country, and then do that for all 82 countries. So each country has its own R. Then plug that back in, predict the share that you should see at any given age group in every single country, and then regress the true share on the predicted share, and that's a goodness of fit measure. And let's see how well it does. okay? And the answer is r squared 0.998. So it's pretty good. Now, let me back off from that and tell you that while 0.998 is perfect, essentially, it's not only this model that would give you a high r squared. Most of what's going on is age. So if I just did a simple naive regression and just said, forget about r, forget about anything, and I just said, how much could we explain simply by putting age in there, I'd still get an r squared of somewhere close to 0.9. Okay, so even the most naive model in the world would get us pretty close. So you don't want to think of this as 0.998 versus 0. You want to think of this as 0.998 versus something like 0.9. Okay, but still, it's pretty good. And what it means is that if I think of this as the demographic structure of the world, we're not going to err very much because it's basically fitting the data perfectly, and that's really what we need for this, for our purposes here. Okay. So that's what I meant by saying this really explains the world perfectly. All right, so let's just look at a plot of entrepreneurship and age. So this is the median age of the country, or the other way you could do it is the shrinkage parameter R. Either way, they're one-to-one mapped with one another. And what you see, of course, is what I told you earlier. The young countries, ones with the low median ages, have the high entrepreneurship rates, and the old countries tend to have the lower entrepreneurship rates, and that's true in this picture. It's also true, by the way, even if you just restrict your attention to OECD countries. You know, you might not want to compare Uganda to Germany, for example. So let's just do it within OECD countries. It's less pronounced here, but it's also the same relationship. So basically, the finding that I started out with shows up in quite strongly in these data. All right, this is the first of the main table of results, and I'm just going to show you really two tables and then pretty much summarize, and we'll be done. So this table just looks across country. It doesn't look within age group. The unit of analysis here is a country year. So this is a panel data set, although that's a bit too strong. It's not a balanced panel. Some countries only have one observation, 1 year of observation. Some countries like the US, UK, Germany have all 10 years of observation. But in this data set, what we're doing is we're looking across country, and what this says is what you already know because I already showed you the picture. So this is just a kind of a regression version of what I showed you in the picture, and that is that the old countries tend to have lower rates of entrepreneurship than the young countries. So the dependent variable here is entrepreneurship rate. And you can do this either with the R or just regress it on the median age of the country, and you can see that you get the relationship that was predicted. And the results are actually quite strong. Shows up pretty much no matter how you do it. Now, please, go ahead. Sorry.
Does R every time series dimension?
Yes, bear with me just for a minute. That's a really good question. I'll come back to you in a second on that. It's actually, just to preview it, it's column, column 7 and 8 is where we'll talk about that, but yeah. For right now, though, just cross-section, just up in these, just think of it as cross-section. All right, now what I want to point out, and again, as I said at the beginning, this is the thing that really surprised us, certainly surprised me, and that is how powerful this effect is as an empirical matter. So if I'm looking at other things that I would have thought, to be honest, before doing this work, I would have thought the most important determinants of entrepreneurship would be things like education level of the country, the cost of starting a business. We always talk about how, Europe has a higher cost of starting businesses in some countries than in others within Europe, and between Europe and the United States. Actually, it turns out the United States now is not very good. It turns out France, it's cheaper to start a business in France right now than it is in the United States. That's a result of actually the last few years of regulation in the U.S. But those would be the things that I would have pointed to. Intellectual property, people always make a big deal about intellectual property rights. That's this EPRI thing. And if you look at that, we entered those. The other thing would be GDP per capita. You know, Uganda's not Germany. You want to look at what GDP per capita. You might want to look at growth rates. You might say, well, one of the reasons Japan isn't starting businesses is not because it's old. It's because, you know, it's a stagnant society. Who wants to invest in Japan? So, you know, you could put in per capita growth rate, that kind of thing as well. So we did that. And occasionally one will matter and occasionally not. But what remains true is that while these effects change a little bit in terms of magnitude, basically they're unaltered. That's really the thing that stands out from this table, is that there's basically still there. The one thing that's kind of interesting, I gave this talk in Switzerland and then actually later in Israel, both of which have compulsory military service. And when I gave it, people said, oh, you know, you ought to look at military service because what happens is if you have compulsory military service, the military is all young people. And so people get to do, you know, the story I told you about James being able to do all these great things at Oracle as a 28-year-old. Well, you know, if you're on an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific, the oldest guy on that aircraft carrier, with the exception of the captain, is like 28 years old. So it's all young people doing all these very high-level technical jobs that require enormous levels of responsibility. It has 5,000 people on it. And so, you know, these guys suggested, why don't you look at that? And so we put that in, and sure enough, it turns out that military having compulsory military service has big effects on entrepreneurship rates, and it's particularly true in aging countries because it seems to be a substitute for the kind of human capital transition that otherwise would take place through the businesses. So it was kind of, you know, someone kind of threw it out. I said, oh, all right, we'll give it a try, and it turned out that it's quite impressive. So again, it comes back to your question that you posed earlier, Tito, about, you know, how does human capital get transferred from one generation to another. Maybe things we don't like about the military, but one of the things we do like about the military is they're pretty darn good at teaching young people some skills. It seems like that works pretty well. And skills that are useful in starting businesses, you know, not in terms of military. All right, so the last point is a gentleman in front of the room asked me about what about R varying over time? And the answer is we have that only for a few countries because it's a panel, okay? But we have it only for a few countries, but that's in the last two columns. So what the last two columns do is they put in country fixed effects. So all of the mileage that we're getting in the last two columns are based only on the within country variation over time and not the between country. And we still see effects. They're not as strong statistically because you don't have as much variation over time as you do across countries. But it still seems to show up. So this would be the story. Your question really relates to my early motivating example of Japan, where you look at Japan in the 1980s and you say it was a dynamic entrepreneurial country. And then now what's happened, and that's basically what this is showing, that even within this period, it does look like those effects matter. Okay, final table, and then I'm going to conclude. So the final story is to say, now let's look not just at a country year as a unit of analysis, but we have 45 age groups within every country. So let's take, for every country, let's define an observation as an age, country, year observation. Okay? And then we can ask, within each age group, what's the entrepreneurship rate for that age group? And let's look at how that varies as a result of this aging stuff. So the most important results are summarized by column. Really, just look at column 1. We can be done with it if we just look at column 1. So what you see is that the older age groups have lower rates of entrepreneurship, but holding age constant, that is within any age group, the older is the country, the lower is the rate of entrepreneurship. And that's what I said before. And again, you already know that because I showed you that picture at the very beginning where I said, look at the old countries, middle countries, young countries. So I already showed you that this was going to show up. But this is just doing it in more detail. and basically this does the same kind of thing. Also, Sir puts in the fixed effects. All right, so that's basically it. There's a more refined way of doing it. I'm not going to tell you what I did here because it's complicated, but let me summarize this in words. Remember at the beginning I said, which effect explains variation across countries? Is it the creativity effect, the energy effect, the fact that old people run out of gas? Or is it the fact that young people in an old society can't get the skills? And what this does is it disentangles those two effects. It basically shuts down one mechanism at a time and then says which one is most important. And the answer is, if I shut down the creativity effect and only focus on the within age group variation across countries, I get an R squared of 0.23. If I put them both in, I get an R squared of 0.25. If I put in only age, I get an R squared of 0.09. And so what that tells you is that almost all the action here is coming not from the fact that old people are less creative, but from the fact that within any given age group, if the country is old, people don't start businesses within any given age group. And that's basically what's driving it. So again, to my mind, that's the most compelling result, but it's also the most surprising because it does speak directly to the question that you posed at the beginning, Tito, which is, how does human capital get transferred from one generation to the other? And the answer is, if you got a bunch of old people around, not very well, because they're going to take all the good jobs and keep them for themselves. So, all right. So let's cut to the end. So what does this say? Well, basically what this tells you is that a human capital framework, simple production of skills over the life cycle, coupled with some demography, provides some pretty strong theoretical predictions, which actually turn out to be true in the data when you look across the 82 countries in the world. There are some very specific predictions. I didn't go through all of them. I didn't go through all the tests. But every one of our 7 predictions from the model turns out to be true strongly, statistically strongly in these data. So we were very encouraged by these results. Now, what does this imply about policy? So, I was in the government for a while, as you mentioned. Let's think about policy for a second. So my student James, I told you, this guy's an amazing guy. Turned out, while he was doing his dissertation, for those of you currently writing your dissertations right now, listen to this story. So, James has a lot of energy and a lot of ideas, and he actually has a lot of money too. And I didn't realize it. Not bad. Yeah, that helps. This is the Donald Trump phenomenon, unfortunately. So James, while he was writing his dissertation, completely unbeknownst to me, was agitating against the one-child policy in China. And what he did was he produced a documentary. He himself, he paid, had people do it with him, but he paid for the documentary to be produced while he was doing his dissertation on the one-child policy and the problems associated with the one-child policy. This is before we wrote this paper, by the way. But obviously, if you're a country that has a one-child policy, what you're doing is you're creating a situation where you're lowering the rate of population growth and pushing toward a shrinking population rather than an aging population. So China already has a very low population growth rate. They relaxed the one-child policy. By the way, I thought James was going to be shot. I was worried. They wouldn't allow this thing to be shown on TV. He had to post it on the internet, and I thought, this guy's nuts. What's he doing? Well, it turned out, for a while he was in some political jeopardy. He was in the United States, but he was in some political jeopardy. When he went back to China, they decided to hold a conference, a very high-level conference on the one-child policy. He missed his graduation because he was at that conference, and he was the major he presented the major paper in favor of eliminating the one-child policy. And in fact, about a year later, the Chinese government relaxed significantly its one-child policy. So, so he actually had a very big effect on the government, and you can see why this stuff actually does feed into policy. The other thing it suggests is that countries like Japan, and certainly Italy right now, if you think about it, have to worry about these population trends and what that's going to imply about business formation and about growth for the future. So there are strategies that one can use that one thinks about. One, of course, is immigration. Immigrants tend to be both young and entrepreneurial. That's true and well documented if you look across countries. So immigration is one policy. If you want to encourage people to make babies, Italians seem to be, pretty good at all those, all those other kinds of things. But the one thing that we would think about in that context is we're not going to worry. If you don't think about organic growth, another way to think about that is retirement policy. So that would be the more direct an obvious thing, given your current position, you certainly can be thinking about those things. I mean, certainly the fiscal impacts are what number one on your mind right now, but there are also effects through retirement policy on what happens to business formation and the growth in the society. So let me stop there and turn it over to Pietro, and thank you all for listening to me, and especially at this late hour. Thank you.